Greetings brethren, CloakingDonkey here with my first ever video on Crowfall. Now before we get into it, a little disclaimer, because I would not like to repeat the encounter of the douche kind I had with Ashes of Creation. I have only peripherally followed this game. I've not done any in-depth research into their Instagram accounts and their Discord server, and as such I may be getting tiny specific details from those social media platforms wrong. If I do, please understand that this is not supposed to be a review, this is simply an opinion piece on what I have just experienced watching their massive reveal video and from what I know from what I have followed. I'm going at the topic of Crowfall as a person looking into this from the outside, like so many other people are as well. And I'm rounding up the basic information for them, presenting it in a way that is easy to understand for people who have not been on board of the hype train for Crowfall since it was announced 3 years ago. If you have been following this game for an extended amount of time, do feel free to watch this video, but don't expect it to necessarily confirm your biases or your preferences as to what this game should be. This is, again, me from the outside looking into this project, as someone not deeply invested into this project specifically, but very much interested in the more general genre of this game. And now let's get into it. So Crowfall. I will honestly admit that until very recently I have pretty much followed Camelot Unchained entirely over Crowfall. Crowfall has always been sort of the second in line to me. Because while their game certainly had an interesting graphic style and some really neat ideas, there were certainly a couple of very much baseline things that I just didn't quite agree with. Such as, for example, the Archetype system. I thought the Archetype system was just far too rigid. And it honestly reminded me way too much of a MOBA or an action RPG, where you pick a character and you can maybe change a few tiny things, but not really all that much, and that's what you get and that's what you have to play with, and it all just kind of plays the same. My other big worry was that they were not really wanting to make real healers in this game and wanted to go more for a support role, which once again reminded me more of action RPGs and MOBAs than of an MMORPG. And having played other MMORPGs without healers, or other MMORPGs that replaced healers with the oh ever so clever potion spam, it's just something that I find absolutely obnoxious. Healers just do something for an MMORPG, and you can obviously say that healers are very much a sort of trope of MMORPGs, but in the end, they are just part of that core design, and in a lot of cases, you cannot just change a part of the core design and expect the entire design to still function the way it functioned before. So I was worried about that, and along with the server clustery, resetty nature of the whole game, which also kind of reminded me more of action RPGs, that kind of frustrated me about the game a little bit and just kept me wary and in a state where I just wasn't quite sure about Crowfall. But recently the guys developing this game have come out with some absolutely groundbreaking changes to the design of this game. They revealed all sorts of cool stuff, but it really culminated yesterday in their 2 massive reveal videos, one of which was for a graphical update. I'm not gonna pontificate on this too much because it's a graphical update, right? I mean, the game definitely looks a lot better with this upgrade, and that's great, but I don't really think it's that important. I don't really think it necessarily needed it. I thought it looked cute before, and now it looks a little bit more professionally cute, I suppose. It's still the overall same art style, it just looks a lot crisper and, well, more professional now, which is great. I mean, really, just look at this footage. It is actually very cool looking and really does make you want to play this game now. So kudos on the graphical updates, but the meat and potatoes of yesterday's reveal was absolutely the changes to the archetype system, or should I say the abandonment of the archetype system. So what I said earlier, that there were archetypes, 12 different classes that had races locked to that specific class, and the race would tie into that class in terms of functionality, and there was really not much you can change about it except that you had a few skills you may have been able to swap out. They now completely abandoned that and went with a classic race and class system. So what used to be the archetypes is now classes, and multiple of the races can be each of the classes. However, it is not a all 12 of the races can be all 12 of the classes situation. It's that every race has about 3 to 5 classes that it can be. So if we take, for example, the Elkin, the big awesome looking stag people, before they were the race choice for the Ranger archetype, and a Ranger would always be an Elkin. Now, however, an Elkin can also be a Confessor, a Knight, and a Templar. And each of these classes can of course also be chosen by other races, so that for pretty much every one of the classes you have 3 to 5 different races that they can be, and every one of the races can be 3 to 5 different classes. That alone is already going to make for so much more variation. You really wanted to be that little guinea pig guy, but you couldn't see yourself playing a duelist? Well, now you can also be a cleric or a knight, and that obviously gives you a much bigger range of what your character can be. But they didn't stop with just changing the archetypes to races and classes, they also added the discipline system. And the discipline system is really interesting because it has a few different facets. Each character can have up to 2 major disciplines, 3 minor disciplines, and 1 weapon mastery. The major disciplines are actually subclasses. They grant your character a whole bunch of extra abilities, both active and passive, and even grant you some extra statistics that will morph your character into a certain direction. So for example, if we look at the Bard major discipline, we can see they get an extra 3 points of elemental mitigation, and then they get 4 different song abilities that they can play to buff their group. They can hand out movement speed, mitigations, increase the health regeneration, or the attack and support power of their party. Whereas the Friar major discipline is a little bit more of a mixed support, where you have some utility for yourself and utility for your group, as well as an extra heal ability that you didn't have before, and a passive that periodically gets you random buffs. And there's also really strange ones like the Reality Warper, who gets +3 extra damage modifier, has an ability that absorbs healing on the target, has a pulsing AoE debuff that increases enemies' cooldowns, and has a passive that increases their damage while they are low on their resource. And yesterday they announced a total of 35 of these major disciplines that various amounts of classes have access to. Not all of these are accessible to all of the classes. Some of them are only available to a few classes, which are, role specific. For example, there's the Agent Provocateur, which is sort of a stealth boosting major discipline, and that is of course only available to classes that are stealthy, namely the Assassin, the Duelist, and the Ranger. And as I just said, you can have 2 of these major disciplines. So those 2 major disciplines plus your base class mean there's actually quite a bit of variety in these, and there's a lot of customization that you can go for, and you can drive your character in a specific direction that they are maybe not even starting out with. You might, for example, be going with a Knight who usually has absolutely no healing abilities, but then you could pick the Dryad and the Friar and suddenly you're kind of an off-healer hybrid class. So that's really damn cool. Next we have the minor disciplines, of which your character can have 3 different ones. They are, however, pretty much just 1 passive ability per minor discipline. So for example, Eminently Punchable, which can be taken by a bunch of different classes, that grants you the passive abilities to gain resources on being hit by enemies. So as you get punched, you get more of whatever resource it is your character uses. Or the Glass Cannon minor discipline gives you a passive ability that increases your damage while reducing your armor. So while these aren't necessarily game-changing like the major disciplines, which can really turn your character into hybrids or give you completely different abilities or specialize you in something very specific, these minor disciplines are a lot more aimed toward refining what you have already built with your major disciplines. For example, the Glass Cannon will just turn your character a little bit more towards damage and away from being tanky. So if you start out with a Knight, you could turn it a little bit more into a frontline damage dealing warrior instead of a full tank. And then lastly, every character can choose 1 weapon mastery ability. So for example, Assassin, Champion, Knight, Legionary, Myrmidon, and Ranger can choose the Master of Axes, which gives them +5 damage bonus slashing and grants them 2 active attacks that will synergize with all their other abilities. So Furious Slash, for example, will reduce long cooldowns that your class might have. So if you play a class that has some really obnoxiously long cooldowns that are very powerful abilities, you can take this Furious Slash and reduce that cooldown so that you can use those powerful abilities more often, while also granting you Demolish Armor, which lets you stack an armor debuff on your enemies. and a passive which makes your attacks randomly add barrier or basic attack power to your character. There are a whole bunch of different weapon mastery abilities, not all of them available to all characters. Just like with the race class choices, pretty much every character will have about 2 to 5 to choose from these abilities, with the higher end of course being for the classes that actually use weapons more. But you can see how suddenly this game has a ton of customization where it practically had none before. The archetype system that they wanted to go with initially is so basic in comparison to what they came up with now. I'm actually really impressed by this new system that they have concocted. We still have all the archetypes and they turned into classes, so suddenly it's actually even more impressive than it was before to have 12 of them. They each have a bunch of different race choices, and then on top of that you have all of these major disciplines that really alter your character. You have the minor disciplines for fine-tuning and the weapon disciplines that just put on that little cherry to really shape where you want your character to go. I really think that this change is excellent, and I'm also very excited to see that there is so much healing stuff hidden in these major and minor disciplines that really allows people to go for more healing focused characters, or to have just more people be able to use healing abilities so that healing actually becomes a more important part of the game. It makes fights just more interesting by drawing them out a little bit and giving you more tactical choices to make throughout. Granted, a healing potion spam also kind of drags the combat out a little bit, but it does it in a very awful, button spammy and very little thought way. So this certainly seems preferable to me. Overall, I really think this game is starting to come together as an MMORPG. It just tried to do a few too many things outside of the box. While I'm not saying you should never think outside of the box, some things are the way they are for a reason, because they just work. And I really think when it comes to races, classes, and healing, and damaging, and tanking, and all that stuff is just there in MMORPGs because it works. And whenever you try to dick around with it too much, it just sometimes ends up not working anymore. However, now that I buttered you up with all of this gushing about Crowfall, I would like to remind you that this game is probably still 1, 2, or 3 years out from its release. So I definitely want to recommend caution when it comes to the hype you let yourself fall for. And don't misunderstand me, these changes are awesome and have absolutely placed Crowfall on my radar where it was kind of teetering on the outside of my radar before. But at the same time, it is important not to get too overzealous for this project. Because even though they have a bunch of gameplay to show and they have a bunch of tests running and everything, something could still horribly go wrong and this game might never see the light of day, as was only very recently demonstrated by EverQuest Next Landmark. And by the way, this does not just go for Crowfall or Ashes of Creation, this also goes for Camelot Unchained and all of the other Kickstarter MMORPGs. While I absolutely think you should keep these games on your radar and you should look forward to them, do keep your hype contained. Don't go crazy and overboard, because it's still going to be a while, and the longer you run on this hype train, the bigger the risk that you'll either burn out and stop caring about the game altogether, or that you will fall into absolute devoted zealotry for this game and become an obnoxious fanboy douche zombie. Just, you know, maybe don't be that guy. Anyway, that's going to be it for this video. I really just wanted to sum up all this cool stuff about Crowfall that I was super excited about yesterday and bring it to you with a bit of my opinion on what I think about it and a cautious look toward the future. If you enjoyed this video, please consider liking it and also consider subscribing to my channel if you have not. You can also find all my videos on vid.me/CloakingDonkey, and you should definitely also go to twitch.tv/CloakingDonkey, where I stream very regularly all sorts of cool MMORPGs and sometimes some other games from my Steam list. But until then, I've been the CloakingDonkey, and I'll see you in another video!